From your world news headquarters on the World Wide Web, it's time for your daily dose of sanity. This is the Meria Heller Show. Meria Heller is a published author, founder of the Universal Wheel, a lifestyle and philosophy based on our interconnectedness to all living things, a Reiki master, and delivers the news with spiritual views. How many intuitive news decoders, animal rights activists, and vegetarian broadcasters are there? Just one, Meria. Meria has provided independent news for a smart audience for over 13 years now on the Meria Heller Show, available at meria.net. MERIA.net. And now, here is your host, the mouth that roars, Meria Heller.
Good morning, world. Welcome to the Meria Heller Show. Today I have an excellent guest with me. It's been a long time since he's been on the show. His name is Paul Armentano. He is the Deputy Director of NORML Foundation, and we'll talk about what that is and what they do. Paul is quite an expert. He's reviewed and commented upon thousands of academic studies and white papers pertinent to cannabis use and its impact on behavior. He's written and done research in over 750 publications. He has a couple of books out. He's also a court-certified expert, having testified to the behavioral effects and pharmacokinetics of cannabis and cannabinoids. So I'm very happy to have Paul with me. He also has a brand new book out called Marijuana is Safer. So why are we driving people to drink? Good question. So without further ado, good morning, Paul.
Good morning, Meria. It's been a long time.
Yes, it has. I was saying it must be at least 10 years. I don't know how that happened, but of course I follow your work constantly because this is an issue that I've been concerned with since I was, 15 years old, and somebody gave me a pass of their joint, and I was like, wow, this is great. Why is this illegal?
Well, certainly a lot's changed in the decade or so since we last talked, and I look forward to speaking with you about some of those changes that are taking place.
Absolutely. Well, why don't we start out with telling my audience what NORML is? What does it stand for?
NORML is the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, and we are a consumer advocacy organization. We stand up for the rights of the cannabis consumer, and NORML believes that an adult who engages in the responsible use of cannabis should not face criminal sanctions or civil sanctions for their consumption of a substance that is objectively safer than alcohol.
Absolutely. And certainly, I keep telling people I've never seen anybody violent or go home and beat up their wives or a bar fight break out because somebody smoked a joint. But when you look at the destruction of alcohol, it's amazing to me that alcohol is legal and marijuana isn't.
It really is. I'm sure most of your listeners are aware that about 2 months ago, the president came out in an interview and made statements similar to that effect, where he acknowledged the objective fact that from a harm standpoint, alcohol poses far greater potential harms to the individual user and to society as a whole than does marijuana. And while there was some pushback he received for making that statement, you'll notice all of the pushback was rhetorical, because factually that statement is correct, and it is incredibly hypocritical that not only is alcohol legal in this country, but it is celebrated in this country. It is ubiquitous within our culture, while at the same time marijuana isn't just criminalized, but the user of marijuana is stigmatized, and our federal laws classify marijuana, even today, as a substance that poses equal harms and dangers as heroin. That's the law. And if that sounds absurd to your listeners, well, then they agree with NORML's position that that law needs to be changed.
Absolutely. But you're so right that alcohol is celebrated, because there's barely a movie you can watch or a show on TV where people aren't, drinking away like it's a normal thing. They'll go over to a rolling bar at 12 in the afternoon and, they're knocking them back as if it's a normal thing. Or you see people doing business deals, can I get you a drink? And it seems very normal.
Sure. And think about the lexicon that we employ when we talk about alcohol. We refer to, or we use the phrase happy hour to refer to the time immediately after work where people flock to the bars because the price of alcohol has been reduced, therefore encouraging individuals to drink more. We use the phrase Joe Six-Pack affectionately to refer to supposedly the average working class American, where if we were to take that language and interpret it literally, we would be referring to someone who is an alcoholic. We celebrate shows like Cheers, where the characters simply sat around a bar. If we juxtapose that same setting with marijuana, we would be condemning those same characters for suffering from amotivational syndrome. But when they raise their glass to toast one another, that's considered a celebratory activity. So it's not just, as I said, comparing and contrasting one substance being legal and the other being illegal. There's an entire culture surrounding alcohol that we celebrate, whereas at the same time we've stigmatized marijuana culture, in addition decriminalizing the plant and criminalizing its users.
Absolutely. Well, those are very valid and true points. I'm sure people will start paying attention a little bit more now that we've actually brought that out, but people don't think in those ways. But I've had a lot of experience with alcoholics in my life, and I can tell you that it's not a pretty picture. They can glamorize it all they want on TV, but I've seen the destruction it does to family, the damage it does to children. They even have groups, for families of alcoholics to go get help. And that's the side they don't show. But it's kind of interesting if you think about it, Paul, because a lot of times if you look at the past history of even the Academy Awards, the actors and they know it going in, the actors that play the stone cold alcoholics are almost guaranteed the Oscar.
Yes. Again, it is a tremendous double standard, and it is really one of the points that myself and my co-authors tried to highlight in the book Marijuana is Safer, So Why Are We Driving People to Drink? I mean, it is clear that by any objective standard, marijuana is far less potentially harmful to health than alcohol. So then why are we, through societal pressures and more importantly, via the law, coercing individuals to select and to recreate by using the more potentially harmful substance? It doesn't make any sense. And what is really significant is that the public has very quickly began to wake up to understand this fact. When we authored the first edition of Marijuana is Safer, which initially was published in 2009, national polls showed that only about 1/3 of the country agreed with the statement that marijuana is safer than alcohol. About 1/3 of the country disagreed with that statement, and about 1/3 of voters thought the two substances posed equal harms. CNN did a poll, a nationwide poll, in January, where they asked that question again, and 74% of respondents in January of 2004 said that they agreed with the presumption that marijuana was in fact safer than alcohol. So we've seen a tremendous shift in public opinion over the last 4 or 5 years since the first edition of Marijuana is Safer came out, and we released an updated and revised edition of the book late last year. So clearly this is a point that's resonating with the general public at large, and again, as I noted at the beginning of the show, this is a point that got quite a bit more gravity and stimulated a whole lot more public discussion when no less than the President of the United States came out and essentially made the same position public.
Right. Well, I think that made that had a huge impact. I don't know that he intended it to have the impact it did, but it made a huge impact. And, you know, when you look at that and you look at even Dr. Sanjay Gupta, I think that's how he says his name, who was so misinformed and against marijuana until he saw that little girl that was on, I believe the strain of the oil was Charlotte's Web, that had cured her incurable seizures, that he actually made a public apology that he was wrong about cannabis. So I think that helps too.
That was a tremendously powerful piece, not just because of the message and not just because of who was delivering the message, but the fact that, as you noted, Sanjay Gupta had been on the record previously opposing marijuana law reform, dismissing the notion that the marijuana plant held therapeutic properties, and he made it a point to make it clear that not only had he shifted his position, but that his prior position had been incorrect and had been ill-informed, and he pointed the finger at the federal government for providing people like him the misinformation that had led him to reach his incorrect opinion that he then corrected. And I think, again, that resonated with the American public. I think the American public, in many ways, were shocked to hear someone of his stature point the finger at the federal government and essentially say, hey, this government hasn't just been lying to all of you about marijuana.
Right.
They've been lying to me as well. And that was a powerful statement. We've seen the polls in support of medical marijuana, which were always quite high to begin with, jump significantly since the airing of that special last August, to the point where nationwide numbers in support of medical marijuana or legalizing medical marijuana now sit around 85-86%, and we've seen some recent statewide polls, one out of New York State and one out of Florida within the past few weeks, showing nearly 90% voter support for legalizing medical marijuana. You're not going to get 9 out of 10 American voters to agree on the time of day,
right,
but they are overwhelmingly in support of this position. I would dare say that we're at a point now where the only voters who aren't necessarily supporting these policies are relegated to law enforcement, drug treatment, or their elected officials, because everyone else is clearly in support.
Right. Well, it's big business. You know, when you look at the fact that a lot of these policemen associations and a lot of lawmakers are heavily invested in these private prisons for profit, you know, they've got to fill those beds and they've got to give them a 90% occupancy guarantee. What's easier to do than to bust, you know, pot smokers? Do you know what I mean? And ruin their lives. Let's not leave that out. So you have to really look at, you know, who's making the money on this.
Yes, we do have to look at that, and we also have to look at, from the standpoint of legislative reform, who do politicians listen to? Many elected officials are former members of law enforcement. They're former prosecutors. They're former sheriffs. And unfortunately, when these people seek guidance on marijuana policy, they don't typically listen to advocacy organizations like NORML. They don't particularly listen to the emails and the phone calls and the letters of their constituents, but they look to their former colleagues who are also in law enforcement, and they tend to seek guidance and take guidance from that very narrow special interest group that has made it clear throughout this entire debate, and they continue to make it clear today, that they have no interest in being involved with the reform of America's marijuana laws. They have no interest in seeing this black market commodity regulated and legalized and brought above ground, and they are fighting tooth and nail to keep the laws in place that lead to the annual arrest of nearly 750,000 Americans for violating pot laws. And that is the reality that we're trying to change.
Right. Well, I think there was a story this morning actually on Yahoo News about an epilepsy group that's asking the government to reclassify pot so that they can study the effects and the benefits it's having for people with epilepsy or people with seizures.
Yes, that was the Epilepsy Foundation of America, and they came out with a very powerful statement last week that did not just call on the federal government to reclassify marijuana, but they said that for individuals who live in states that have authorized the use of medical marijuana, that epilepsy should be a qualifying diagnosis in all of those states. And they also said, most importantly, that the federal government ought not to interfere in any instance where a doctor had recommended marijuana therapy to a patient. Mm-hmm. And again, this is a leading medical organization. They're not the first leading medical organization to take this sort of a position, because the American Nursing Association has previously done so, the American Public Health Association has previously done so, the Lymphoma Association of America has previously done so, and so have many other groups. But it is a powerful statement in its own right to see an organization that is based just outside of the Beltway take a very strong position telling the federal government that they've dropped the ball on this issue and they need to bud out of this issue and not interfere with the doctor-patient relationship when it comes to the use of marijuana in situations involving epilepsy and some of these severe intractable pediatric epilepsy cases that we've seen anecdotally in Sanjay Gupta's special and in a number of news reports that are now being carried around the country.
Right, absolutely. About a year and a half ago, I met this man at my gym where I work out, and he's in his early 70s, and he's a Vietnam veteran. And since Vietnam, he has seizures, he has blackouts, he has constant noise ringing in his ears, he can't sleep at night. And the VA, as good as they've been, have not been able to figure out what to do to help this guy. And nothing works that they gave him. All kinds of terrible drugs, nothing worked. And Arizona passed medical marijuana, and we actually have the only dispensary in the county I live in my town. And I was talked to him several times about marijuana, and I said, how could it hurt? Nothing else works. What do you have to lose? And he did finally give in, and he went and got, and they make it very expensive, by the way. By the time you see a doctor and you get approved and you get your license, it's a couple $100. And to a veteran, that's a lot of money. But he did get on one of the strains of the oil, and he told me within 3 days he saw tremendous improvement. Not perfect, but big improvement. The fact he could sleep 3 hours in a row was like a shock to him.
Yeah, and we see those reports anecdotally, and when one looks at the controlled clinical studies, and there are several dozens of those as well, pertaining to marijuana and assessing its efficacy, again, we see consistently that this is a safe therapeutic substance, particularly relative to the safety standards that society already accepts for other conventional medications, and that this is a substance that provides genuine efficacy for a number of therapeutic conditions. That's what the science says. This isn't a question of we need more research on marijuana, right. We need to learn more about marijuana. The issue before us is that we have a public policy that is divorced from what the science tells us about marijuana. And that is the crux of the issue. We need to change the policy so that it reflects the reality about cannabis, its consumers, and the science surrounding the plant.
I agree, but didn't the demonization of marijuana or cannabis, marijuana as I understand it, was a very negative, scary term they gave to it. But didn't this demonization really start off as a way of blaming the Mexicans and not wanting Mexicans in this country, saying they were all bringing in this dangerous drug?
So when one looks back at the history of marijuana prohibition, and we dedicate a chapter to this subject in Marijuana is Safer, what one sees is that there were different rationales used to promote the prohibition or the criminalization of cannabis based on what region of the country someone resided in. So the rationales that were used, for instance, regarding the prohibition of marijuana in the northeastern part of the United States weren't necessarily the same rationales that were put forward publicly in the southeastern region of the United States or in the southwestern regions of the United States. But by and large, you do bring up an important point, and that is not just for marijuana, but regarding the prohibition of drugs in general. And I would argue that the sensationalism that often accompanies campaigns leading to the run-up of prohibition of certain substances is largely based on race, and it's largely based on class. That was the case 100 years ago when states were beginning to outlaw marijuana. It even remains the case in the modern era when one looks at, for instance, the disproportionality in sentencing regarding powder cocaine versus crack cocaine, and how crack cocaine sentencing, when the law was enacted, it was 100-to-1 sentencing disparity. Now it's 18-to-1. That was based largely upon race and stereotypes regarding who the public believed the stereotypical user of the substance was. That was the case with marijuana as well, particularly in the southwestern parts of the United States, where the drug was associated largely with Mexican immigrants. It was also the case in the southeastern United States, where at that time the drug was largely associated with use among African Americans. And both of those classes and their use of marijuana was stigmatized and sensationalized in the run-up leading to the state-level prohibitions of cannabis, which began as early as 1913, and those stereotypes also played a role in the federal prohibition of cannabis in 1937.
Well, I mean, if you look at the statistics of prison, you know, how many articles do I see, how many news stories, that even though there are more white people that abuse illegal drugs, there are more black people in jail for it. So I don't think that racism's gone away. Right,
when it comes to marijuana, we see in the arrests themselves, the ACLU did an excellent nationwide report that they published last year that found African Americans are arrested for pot possession offenses about 4-to-1 the rate of whites, even though both ethnicities essentially use marijuana at largely the same rates. And we see this for other drugs as well.
Right. So it's still a class war, no matter how you look at it. You know, a few months ago, I watched Ken Burns' series on Prohibition. And first of all, I never knew what a nation of drunks we were before Prohibition. The people were drinking from the minute they got up till the minute they went to sleep, and staggering through the streets of the country drunk all the time. It must have been quite a time to live. Glad I wasn't there. But watching it, what interested me the most is you could very easily have switched out marijuana in that movie for alcohol, because the ridiculousness of prohibition doesn't work.
Of course. And one of the talking points I'm fond of saying is that the criminalization of marijuana is a disproportionate response to what, at worst, is a public health issue and not a criminal justice issue. And I think that there's largely today a recognition of that fact, but there are still opponents of marijuana legalization who cannot wrap their head around the fact that just because we may share some public health concerns about marijuana use, that is not in and of itself a justification to keep a policy in place that results in the arrest, prosecution, and incarceration of adults who choose to use this substance. We may share concerns about youth use of marijuana. We might share concerns about marijuana potentially exacerbating certain psychiatric disorders in those that have a family history of mental illness. But even if we're to accept those concerns at face value, just having those concerns does not justify criminal prohibition. If anything, that is an argument for regulating the substance so that we can standardize the production and the dosage of the substance, and so we can educate the community that consumes the substance as to the potential risks. That's what we do with alcohol. That's what we do with tobacco. That's what we do with prescription drugs. All substances that pose far greater harms to the user than marijuana. But for some reason, we criminalize marijuana and we don't apply those same principles to cannabis.
Well, I think a lot of it is just people's ignorance and their brainwashing. You know, here in this small town I live in the mountains, because we have a dispensary, some of the old people, you know, I watched them post in our little local newspaper how ugly and violently disgusting they get, because they really think this dispensary is going to ruin the town. We're going to be a town overridden by, you know, drug addicts, and I mean, such ridiculousness. And I try not to answer them in the paper, but I can't help myself. And most of the time I just tell them, I think you've seen Reefer Madness one time too many. And I tell them, why don't you drive down to the... And first of all, the dispensary is off the beaten track. It's not like it's in anybody's way. I said, but if you sat outside the dispensary just for half an hour, all you're going to see are old, infirm people going in there for their medication. I said, why don't you stand outside and tell those people that they don't deserve that relief? You know, I don't make any points with these people. But I noticed that older people really are so super brainwashed, Paul, into believing, you know, the horrors of Reefer Madness. You know, talk about a propaganda film. And yet these same old people will sit, you know, they'll also say they've got all kinds of aches and pains and they kind of live with it. Well, that's their choice.
Right. I mean, cannabis, because of years, or I should say decades of propaganda and criminalization, tends to yield a visceral response in the American public. In some portions of the public, it's a positive visceral response. In other portions of the public, it's a very negative visceral response. But what is at issue here isn't so much the plant itself or the science about the plant. It is what that plant symbolizes to people. And that's why we see this visceral response. That's why we see this emotional response in regards to the cannabis plant. It's not so much about marijuana per se. It's about what that person believes the plant symbolizes. And in many ways, this entire battle over marijuana and marijuana policy is simply a continuation of culture wars that have been fought in this country decades previously.
Yeah, but back in like the 20s and stuff, weren't a lot of the medications sold? Didn't they prescribe cannabis to people?
Yes, there were medications that were marketed and produced by some well-known major pharmaceutical companies like Eli Lilly or Merck that did contain elements of the cannabis plant. And those medications largely became obsolete in the early 1940s after the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. But keep in mind, there was not necessarily an understanding among a majority of the public at that time that the Marijuana Tax Act was going to apply to these sort of pharmaceutically produced products that were generally marketed under the term cannabis, marijuana. So again, and one has to keep in mind too, this was an entirely different era. The level of communication, the level of understanding amongst the public was certainly not the same as it would be today. The reality is that the Marijuana Tax Act was passed and signed into law with very little fanfare. This was not an issue that was highly debated or contested, or one where there was particularly any public input in at the time. And in many ways, it wasn't a particularly dramatic position for the federal government to take, because between the years of 1913 and 1936, we had somewhere in the vicinity of 30 states all separately outlawing the marijuana plant during that period of time. So the federal government was not leading us into an era of marijuana prohibition. They were simply following the lead of what the states have already done. I actually find that lesson very instructive as to how we are going to re-legalize marijuana, because once again, I don't think we can look to the federal government to take the lead on this issue, but we're going to look to the states. And just like the states led us into this era of marijuana prohibition, and the federal government eventually rubber-stamped it, now we see the states leading us out of this era of prohibition, imposing alternatives to prohibition. And I think once again, the federal government eventually is going to follow suit when a critical mass is reached and a significant number of states have essentially said that they are no longer going to participate in marijuana prohibition, and they're going to pursue alternative policies. That's how alcohol prohibition ended, very similarly. 10 states decided to opt out of the prohibition of alcohol, and at that time the federal government had a choice to make. They could either use their political clout, they could use their resources, and they could go into those states and essentially federalize what had previously been state illicit activity, or they could step aside and let the states decide which policy worked best for them. And the federal government chose the latter.
Well, let's hope that happens now. Paul, we're going to take a short break, so I'm going to ask our listeners to stay with us. Paul Armentano and I will be right back.
I'm sure you're enjoying the information you're hearing on this episode of The Meria Heller Show, heard internationally at Meria.net. Did you know that Meria does 4 shows a week and has over 1,000 hours of excellent informative shows on her site? Maria's been at this for years, and you get the benefit of the best education anywhere for a subscription of choice. Your subscription gives you total access to the entire site, the archives, and the new shows, all without any commercial interruptions, thanks to the show being supported by those who appreciate the truth. The site's available 24/7, and all the shows are downloadable for your favorite device. Enjoy the second half of this show and then come over to Meria.net, that's Meria.net, and pick a subscription of your choice. It's a win-win for all of us. Now back to this excellent show.
Okay, I'm back and speaking with Paul Armentano, Deputy Director at NORML. And if you're not familiar with NORML, there's a live link right here. It's NORML.org. You can get involved there. You can join. You can sign up for their newsletter. You can donate. And you can do your part to help legalize marijuana. Paul, one thing that I think there's a difference, and I'd like to ask you, you're the best person to ask. A lot of people say they want pot to be legalized, and some say they want it to be decriminalized, and they say there's a difference. So what is the difference?
Sure. There's a conflation of those terms, and I do think it is important that we speak explicitly as to what we're talking about. Decriminalization is a term that came out of a presidential commission report in 1972. This was the Schaefer Commission. When Congress enacted the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which essentially criminalized marijuana use, possession, cultivation, trafficking, they categorized marijuana as a Schedule I substance, but they also called on an expert commission to study marijuana and study marijuana policies and make federal recommendations for how marijuana should be treated. And in 1972, the Schaefer Commission recommended that Congress decriminalize marijuana. What did they mean? What they meant was that the individual adult consumer of marijuana ought not to face criminal sanctions for their possession and use of marijuana, and they should not face criminal penalties for non-profit transactions of marijuana. That is what they meant by decriminalization. Rather than facing criminal sanctions, they felt that the individual should face a civil fine for their possession of marijuana. But decriminalization still maintains criminal penalties in place for the commercial production, trafficking, and sale of marijuana. So essentially what it does is it criminalizes the marijuana black market. It maintains a classification of marijuana as a contraband substance, but it tries to remove the individual consumer from running afoul of the criminal justice system by sanctioning those individuals with civil fines. That is what decriminalization is, and that is a policy that has been imposed by about 15 or 16 states in this country in the years since the Schaefer Commission made that recommendation. Legalization and regulation dictates that the marijuana plant is no longer an illicit commodity, but instead is a legal commodity that one can possess, sell, and cultivate if one is abiding by the regulations that govern such activity. Legalization further says that an individual who is of age, who possesses or uses marijuana, does not face criminal sanctions, nor does that individual face any civil sanctions. And that's why we differentiate between the policies of, say, Colorado or Washington, where marijuana is legal and regulated, versus the policies in a state like California or Massachusetts, where simple possession is decriminalized, but marijuana is still considered to be contraband.
Right.
That means law enforcement has a mandate to not only interfere with transactions that they see involving marijuana, but they have the authority and the mandate to use their full power to seize that marijuana and confiscate it, because the marijuana itself is still considered to be contraband, not a legal commodity.
Right. Well, you see stories, and I see them all the time, of police doing these no-knock raids, etc., on people's homes because they suspected they smelled marijuana, or somebody said they had, plant remnants in their garbage. Turns out to be tomato plant remnants. I mean, it's really insane how much police activity, force, and expense is being spent on people who are choosing to smoke pot instead of drink alcohol. So I would say, from what you're just saying, we need to ask for it to be legalized, not decriminalized.
We do, and NORML takes the stance that decriminalization does not go far enough, because it leaves the black market in place, and it leaves the classification of marijuana to be contraband material. That certainly does not go far enough. We have millions of people using marijuana. Decades of prohibition have not dissuaded the American public from using marijuana, nor has it inhibited the American public's access to marijuana.
All right.
What we need to have is a public policy that reflects the reality that marijuana is a popular substance, that most adults use the substance responsibly, and we need to regulate the consumption, the production, and retail transactions involving marijuana accordingly. And that's what regulation provides. Prohibition is an absence of regulation.
Prohibition's like a
is
tease.
An absence of control.
Right, but
If we want to control the marijuana plants, then we need to legalize it and regulate it, much like we do tobacco or alcohol, which are highly regulated products, but access to those products by the population that is of age to legally use them is not particularly an issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, it amazes me. With so many places you can buy alcohol. I mean, even the local pharmacy now is carrying alcohol, and they were all happy to announce it. And I'm like, God, everywhere you go, you can buy alcohol. And, you know, I would think it contributes more to a societal breakdown than pot. And yet you have people, even where the voters have spoken for medical marijuana in Arizona, that are still, you know, talking ignorance from, 100 years ago. And Paul, I have to tell you something. Since I'm 15, I think I was 15 years old living in Brooklyn. One of my friends came out with a joint. I had no idea what it was. And interesting, I think when I was younger like that, the laws against marijuana were much easier. Nobody really went to jail for it that I can remember for, maybe 20 years, for like 60s through the 80s. But what's interesting is I would have to say that the people, and I'm in my 60s now, I would say that I have met in my lifetime no more than 10 people who could honestly say they never smoked pot. And I'm pretty popular, okay?
Sure. And again, this is what we see by the failure of prohibition. If criminalization worked, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation right now.
Right.
If criminalization worked, the voters in Colorado, by 55% of the vote, would not have gone to the ballot booth and said, we are electing to set up an alternative system to that of prohibition. If prohibition worked, the voters of Washington State would not have done the same thing, again, by 55% of the vote. Mm-hmm. The reality is that prohibition has failed to meet its stated goals, and it's destroyed a lot of lives in its wake. And the American people understand this substance isn't going away. It existed in this society preceding marijuana prohibition. Mm-hmm. It continues to exist. In fact, it flourishes in this society despite marijuana prohibition. So again, legalizing and regulating marijuana isn't introducing a new substance to the popular culture. It is simply amending our laws to reflect activity that is already flourishing within the popular culture.
Absolutely. What did you think about Jerry Brown, who was one of the biggest, hippies of the 60s? I think even for a while he dated Linda Ronstadt, and everybody liked him because he was basically a hippie and I'm sure a pot smoker. Coming out this week, and, it's funny how people become saintly when they get old, and saying that, the world's too dangerous a place for everybody in America to be walking around stoned.
Yes, it was disappointing, but again, not surprising. We just don't see a whole lot of courage demonstrated by our elected leaders when it comes to advocating for changes in drug laws. Mm-hmm. Even amongst the cohort of people who have firsthand experience with the substance and are otherwise considered to be generally fairly progressive. In fact, what's doubly frustrating is that it sometimes appears to be those lawmakers who have a history with marijuana and have a stereotype of being seen as quite liberal and quite progressive on issues, who for some reason seem to feel the need to assuage their conscience to try and suddenly become teetotalers or prohibitionists when it comes to this particular issue.
Absolutely.
Governor Brown has never been good on the marijuana issue. When he's held political office, despite what his personal predilections may have been in his past. But he's hardly the only example of that. We recently saw the governor of New Hampshire, Democrat Maggie Hassan, come out and publicly make very strong comments opposing the legalization of marijuana after the House in New Hampshire approved a bill to regulate marijuana use, despite Governor Hassan acknowledging that she herself used marijuana in college, and also she's acknowledged that she doesn't believe that individuals who use marijuana should necessarily be arrested and face jail for using marijuana, yet she threatened to veto the very legislation that would stop the arrest of people who consume and use marijuana in her own state. She didn't even seem to be aware of the hypocrisy of that position.
Well, that's the other thing. The hypocrisy is off the charts. It's like we had our fun, but now we don't want anybody else to have it, and now we're going to be holy rollers. You know, prohibition doesn't work, and especially for these holy rollers, you know, they need to remember that there was prohibition in their Garden of Eden. And how well did that work out when the apple was prohibited from Eve, okay? It's like being a parent, you know, the more you tell your kids they can't have something, the more attractive it becomes. But, you know, my personal opinion, Paul, is I think it would be a good thing to make smoking marijuana mandatory for our world leaders. Because I think that if they actually got to a peaceful state where they're thinking and communing with their higher selves, they might be less apt to keep blowing up the planet. You know, I want to go from legalize it to make it mandatory for world leaders.
Yeah, and again, I think it really speaks to the type of personality that is attracted to holding public office. I mean, by the very nature of the job, you have to presume that there is a level of arrogance where one can assume that they know what is best for everyone else.
Right.
And unfortunately, the use of marijuana, this is an issue that I think is largely an anathema to those individuals who truly believe they know better and that they can micromanage everyone else's lives in accordance with the way they think people should live. And we've seen this dramatic change in public opinion, where it is clear now that legalizing marijuana is the majority opinion. This is no longer the fringe position. This is the status quo. This is what most people support. Yet we have seen virtually no changing of public opinion amongst those in positions of elected office. They simply have not gotten the memo, or they refuse to acknowledge the change that's taking place all around them. And that is really one of the most vexing issues that we as advocates face, is that we've made our case to the American people. And the American people, conversely, have been trying to make their case to their elected officials. But on this particular issue, the majority of elected officials simply refuse to acknowledge the desires of their constituents.
Well, don't forget, you have big lobbies, you know, probably paying them off. I mean, one of the people that don't want legalization the most is the beer lobby. You know, so, and I understand that now the medical distributors don't want the legalization because they're afraid they'll lose business. You know, and it's just an insane thing. I could understand, you know, alcohol's got to realize they're going to lose a big bang of their buck if marijuana becomes legal. But, you know, there's always people that are going to prefer alcohol to pot. So I don't really see that anybody's going to go broke.
You know, alcohol is so ubiquitous in this culture and in this country that, you know, people ask me all the time. They say, you know, is marijuana a complement for alcohol? Is marijuana a potential substitute for alcohol? And what I tell them is that we just don't know, because there hasn't been in the modern era a level playing field where marijuana could compete with alcohol. And even now in states like Colorado and Washington, where a legal marijuana market is emerging, it's still is not on the same playing field with alcohol. Because as I noted, alcohol is ubiquitous in this country. Alcohol's had a whole hell of a head start over marijuana. Alcohol has a budget for advertising that dwarfs the entire budget surrounding, marijuana law reform. The alcohol industry probably spends more money on advertising in a single day than we spend in our entire annual budget. You can go out in public and drink alcohol. We have baseball stadiums named after alcohol distributors. Marijuana, despite its popularity within the modern culture, is never going to have that sort of ubiquity within our culture. There's no way marijuana is ever going to be able to compete anytime soon on that scale. So I really don't think the alcohol industry has a whole lot to fear in regards to them losing market share, because they've had such a head start and they're such a giant industry. And I don't believe, even with the advent of marijuana law reform, that marijuana as an industry will ever be allowed to grow and proliferate at the level that we've seen the alcohol industry grow, and even the tobacco industry for that matter.
Right. Well, those are all good points. But my thought is, you look at Colorado now, where, they broke records on how much tax they've already collected and how much pot they've sold since it became legal. And I think the money aspect will be what will change the law.
Clearly there has been a push by some advocates to emphasize the potential economic benefits that surround the regulation and, of course, the taxation of marijuana sales. And clearly, I think that there is an appeal to those arguments. But I have to say, as somebody who's been working on this issue for nearly 20 years and got into this issue at a time where it was so improbable to consider a day where we would have, for instance, what we have in Colorado with licensed retail marijuana sales and the state imposition of an excise tax and a sales tax, that the economic interests and the potential economic benefits of this change in policy were never the driving force for my own personal advocacy.
Yeah, but America was never as broke as it is today.
True.
We were never this broke and desperate.
Legalization didn't raise a single dime for this country. It would still be the right thing to do.
Absolutely.
Because prohibition doesn't work, and it's destroying the lives of otherwise law-abiding good people. And that's ultimately why we need to change this.
Absolutely. I keep saying they should just open the doors to all these prisons and let all these pot smokers out. People that are in there for victimless crime shouldn't be in there in the first place. Let alone the fact that smoking a joint should never have been a crime in the first place. Where's that freedom we talk about? Where's that American freedom?
Exactly. And when one looks back again at the history of marijuana prohibition and the arguments that were publicly put forward to advocate for prohibiting marijuana, we laugh at those arguments now. We as a society acknowledge that those were based on falsehoods and ignorance. Yet, while we acknowledge that the arguments supporting the policy were based on nonsense, we've still never gotten around to changing the policy that is in place based on those false arguments.
Absolutely. Well, the time has come, and like I said, I never believed in a million years I'd live to see already what I have seen happen with marijuana, so we just got to keep going. Paul, thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to talking to you some more.
Thank you. Let's make a point to do this again and not necessarily wait another 10 years. Although if we do, we may be able to talk about legalization at the national level next time.
Hey, we might be able to do the show smoking a joint.
We might.
Take good care, Paul. Thanks for everything you do. We'll stay in touch for sure. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Paul Armentano, check him out, NORML.org. Get the education. Teach your friends the education. I can't believe people are still in the headspace that they are. Anyway, tomorrow, Stars Are Us with Joe Anthony. Thanks for listening to the show and supporting it, and I'll see you guys then.
Thank you for listening and supporting The Meria Show. Tell others what you learned today. Knowledge becomes wisdom only when it's shared. Encourage others to subscribe today. www.meria.net. Often imitated, never duplicated. A world of information all in one place. www.meria.net. Always ahead of the curve. Always on your side. Get active or get radioactive. Subscribe today.